"You're a witness, Maya, so you're staying." I said it then, softer than I meant to, because saying it loud felt like a confession, and because the rain had turned my shirt to cling to my ribs and made my hands shake like a child's. He looked at me the way people look at things they collect, with an ownership that wasn't entirely violent and wasn't entirely kind. His eyes were a steady, dangerous sea. His jaw was a map of old battles. I was not supposed to meet men like him. I was not supposed to be seen. Yet there I was, standing in the cold glow of a back alley street lamp, my breath fogging the space between us, and had a car idling with the engine low and patient like a predator biding its moment. The deal had been made under the cover of night in a warehouse 2 blocks over. Voices, a brief flash of steel, men moving like ghosts, and I had been the only living thing to witness it. I had run without thinking, my phone clasped uselessly in my fist, feet slapping wet pavement until the city blurred into a smear of neon and rain. I had called the police because I had been taught to call the police, because of a certificate in my drawer that said emergency response, because it was how normal people behaved when they saw wrongs. Instead, I had nearly called death, because death carried a suit and a leniency in the way he spoke, because Death's name was a man called Dominic Bellini, and he stepped out of the driver's side and smiled like he already knew me. The first thing he asked was not where the witnesses were or why I was alone. He said, "You shouldn't have seen that." His voice was a low instrument. It filled the alley like heat. I thought at that moment of my mother on a hospital bed, the shadow of a hospital bill larger than the machine keeping her alive. I thought of the eviction notice pinned to our apartment door, and of the neighbors who didn't look up when trouble passed. I thought of how, in the end, the world preferred we be quiet, small, invisible. Dominic's hand found my elbow with an intimacy that ripped the air out of me, and then replaced it with a different kind of panic. The knowledge that I had no map for what he intended. He could put me somewhere and the world would forget me again. He could keep me in a room that looked like a cage of velvet and denial. He could kill me and no one would ask why. I had no plan. I had a swollen sense of urgency and an instinct to survive. So I lied. I said I'd call the police again. He let me for a heartbeat and then shook his head, the motion like a small dismissal of all the things I've been taught to trust. "You're safer with me," he said. It shouldn't have been a comfort. It was the most honest offer I'd ever been given. The first major moment after the alley, a daze rounded by the headlights of his car and the warmth of leather seats, was all silence and the sound of rain. He didn't push me. He watched me breathe and count, as if keeping score of whether I would break. He told the driver where to go in terse sentences, and then turned to me with a single question that would change the axis of my life. "Who are you?" I told him my name because names are small and defenseless. They fit into pockets. "Maya Romano," I said, and the way that rolled off my tongue felt like a relic of my old life. He didn't ask about my job or my mother's condition. Instead, he wanted the details that mattered to men like him: family, debts, enemies. I told him enough. He told me nothing in return. On the way to his place, though it didn't feel like a place, it felt like a contained, foreign country. He explained, in minimalist sentences, the stakes. Someone had crossed lines that weren't theirs to cross. People have been watched. Rules have been broken. A witness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant consequences. He didn't promise safety because he didn't need to. What passed for promise around him was an assumption of control. He folded me into that assumption. As the skyline blurred past, I thought of my mother again, of calculators and late-night shifts at the clinic, of the small, persistent life we had carved out in a city that didn't notice until it was necessary. I thought of the way I'd always managed to keep fear at bay with lists and schedules and an iron will. None of that mattered when a man with a reputation like a bruise offered you sanctuary. Subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from and the local time. Then back to the story. After that short, absurd plea to keep breathing, we slid into the world he'd built. The car pulled up to a gate that looked ornamental but felt like a warning. It opened to a path lined with hedges that were too perfectly cut, like they belonged in a painting of a life I was not supposed to have. The mansion beyond was a thing of marble and glass, a fortress with chandeliers like constellations and rugs that softened every footfall until sound itself was polite. The men who moved inside it were silent and efficient, collars pristine, guns concealed in the kind of places that suggested planning and habit. They guided me through corridors that smelled of citrus and tobacco until we reached a room with a balcony that overlooked a garden no one had time to care for. Dominic left me there with an attendant, a woman named Rosa who had a face like granite softened by warmth, and a man called Marco who carried a file and eyes like mine when I had been 10 and too brave. They were polite, they were professional, they were instruments. Then he came back, and silence settled like a hand across the table. He sat opposite me and asked questions as if reading a brief. He asked who else had been there, who I had spoken to, whether I had seen the man who'd been shot. I answered because there was nowhere not to answer. Each reply was a small undoing of my old life. Each banality I offered, the color of a jacket, the pattern on a wrist, felt like an offering. When I finished, he leaned back and said only, "You will stay here with us until this is done." It was an order wrapped as a safeguard. The walls buckled inward with things unsaid. Escape was not simple. Freedom had a cost. My stomach tried to forget the hospital chart beside my mother's bed. I thought of all the promises I owed her, of being there at dawn for medication, of making the calls, of folding laundry into familiar stacks. Dominic read the expression on my face. He did not pity. He observed. Then he moved, and a woman appeared with a phone and a paper. She said, "We will ensure she cannot be traced. We will handle the bills." That sentence struck me harder than any threat. He had the power to erase debt like a magician erases scars, and he offered to erase mine. In exchange, I would become visible in a world I had never wanted to enter. The choice was a poor one. Walk into safety with shackles of another sort or step back into the thin air of a life where my mother's bills were a tide that never subsided. Part of what made him terrifying was how ordinary he could be in his cruelty. He insisted that my mother be taken care of as a condition of my cooperation. Someone would monitor her medications, pay for her treatments, sign papers, things I could not manage while hidden. He placed my mother's care in hands that owed him everything. It felt like handing my heart to someone who could squeeze and crush it by accident. I agreed. I said yes to things I didn't understand because I was tired and because I didn't believe in miracles, but I believe in obligations. The mansion held its own rules. Lights that dimmed when he wanted privacy. Kitchens that produced food silently. Mirrors that reflected not your face, but your place in a room. I was given a bedroom that was grander than any I had ever slept in, but smaller in one key detail. It had a view only of a manicured courtyard and windows that locked from the outside. It was luxurious, and it was a gilded cage. At night, I woke to the sound of muffled voices halfway down the hall and the constant low thrum of men watching. It was a lullaby of protection. I tried to call the police once, fumbling with numbers on a borrowed phone. The call didn't go through, a polite automated voice in the background, and then Dominic's shadow filling the doorway. He smiled, the expression like a blade wrapped in velvet, and said simply, "You'll learn we solve things quietly. You'll learn to trust us, or you'll learn not to at a cost you won't like." He never raised his hand. He didn't need to. I swallowed bile and told myself I was choosing. Yet every choice he offered me came tethered to his presence. Days folded into the same pale script. Dominic instituted a routine that suited what he needed and what I could tolerate. He sent people to sit in the living room and bring tea that was never quite hot enough to burn. He had me speak with lawyers who asked about witness protection programs and then shrugged with the same hands that signed off on $1 million undertaking. He told me stories from his childhood, in clipped scraps, nothing like confession and something like an offering. He had been a son once, he said, and a brother, and their deaths had taught him that the world required a steady hand. That hand, he implied, had become his. He watched me while I slept the sleep of the exhausted. He asked me once if I had someone waiting for me if all of this passed. I thought of Marcus, of his easy laugh and the way he'd left after the bills stacked up and the promises didn't. I thought of every man who had come and left like seasons. I said no. His mouth tightened and became a line I couldn't read. Then stay, he said, and it was not a question. He began to arrange things around me with a precision that felt like both mercy and ownership. He paid my mother's rent. He had men speak to my boss, fabrications that explain my absence, a family emergency, a need for rest. He cleared my debts and put a sum into an account that would sit there, growing like a secret florid with dark money. In exchange, the men watching me became a second family, and I hated that family for its silence, and yet leaned on them because humans lean where the smallest light is offered. The weeks in the mansion were training and entanglement. I learned unspoken signals. A knock meant wait. A ring twice meant danger. I found unexpected comforts in small things. Rose's way of laying out a breakfast tray, the way Marco would slide a packet of tissues across the table when I frowned, and Dominic's odd habit of leaving doors slightly ajar if he expected me to listen in the night. He was not an easy man to love. He was a man arranged mostly of shadows and ceremonies. Yet slowly, the parts of him that were not cruelty revealed themselves. An unease when I spoke of my mother, a tenderness in his insistence that I not overwork or leave the mansion's grounds, odd gestures like a vase of lilies appearing by my bedside after a nightmare. He fractured into small, human pieces around me. One afternoon, while the rain knifed against the glass, I found him at the library window, looking at a photograph of children in faded black and white. They were my responsibility, he said. They are gone. His hand closed around the frame with a grip that told me his grief had been a lever in forging his empire. It also told me that protection, for him, meant a rigidity and a violence I could not always reconcile with kindness. When danger flickered at the edges, footmen seen by a neighbor, a car waiting too long across the street, he moved with a speed that tore gifts from the air. Men in suits would arrive without sound, and the city would adjust its breath as if the storm had receded. He was relentless. He kept me from returning to my mother, and when I pushed, he reminded me that the choice to endanger her for my agency was not a choice at all. A turning point came when someone tried to break into the mansion. It was not until the sound of a glass shattering, subtle, elegant, cut through the night that the world became crystalline danger. I had been in my room, pages of a book spread across my lap, believing momentarily that fiction could protect me. The alarms were not loud. They were efficient, controlled bursts, directives shouted through walls, boots in time. In the chaos, Marco stood by my door, and his face was hurricane still. He handed me a shawl and said nothing, eyes fixed like an anchor. Dominic's voice was a different instrument then, calm, precise, dangerous. From main hall, we heard him issue commands. There were footsteps, then a sharp crack, the kind of sound that rewires the body, and then silence that was thicker than any beating of sweat. When everything calmed and the men returned, they were different. They had a smell of oil and something metallic like rain on iron. Dominic came to my room and sat on the bed, so close the sheet creased between us. He didn't say, "I told you so." He said instead, "This should have been cleaned by now." His expression made it clear that there was an assigned list of wrongs to be righted, and he had not yet started. I pressed a palm to my heart. The fragility of my life pressed out of me like breath from lungs that had been too tight for too long. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go to the hospital, to my mother's bed, to the arithmetic of pills and schedules and the small conjuring tricks that had always kept our lives afloat. He understood, or at least he pretended to, and he made me an offer that felt like a trap dressed as liberation. I could go, with protection, but I could not go alone. I watched his face when he said it. There was a tenderness in the way he spelled out restrictions. No witnesses along the route, a car that would not be followed, but also an assertion of control. It felt inextricable. I agreed because my sense of what was reasonable had stretched thin like old elastic. I clung to the chance to touch my mother's hand without the fear of men watching my back. Dominic arranged for a slow, careful trip to the hospital. The visit to the hospital was surreal, like walking through a dream with someone else's boots. We arrived in a car that smelled faintly of cedar and leather, and rose through the city like a thing cloaked by other people's eyes. The hospital smelled of bleach and cough suppressants and the small brave things people kept in drawers. I pushed open the door to my mother's room and felt the world tilt. She looked smaller than I remembered, a creature compacted by illness. Her hair was thinner, her hands like paper. Relief and shame tangled in my throat. I had left her because I couldn't bear the weight of her bills, but I had also accepted help that had tied my life to a man who could claim me. Dominic stood in the doorway like a shadow cast by a pillar. He did not enter. His code of distance had the shape of respect. When my mother opened her eyes and saw me, the light that poured into her face was a thief, the kind that steals years and gives you back one bright second. She reached for my hand, and the chain of guilt I had carried snapped like a brittle twig. I told her, halting, about the help. I told her I had people paying for the supplies and the tests. Her eyes flicked to the doorway without judgment, only curiosity, and then she squeezed my fingers and said, "As long as you're safe, my heart." It was the smallest thing, and it felt like absolution. Dominic slipped a hand into his pocket and produced 2 envelopes. One addressed for the hospital with a lawyer's neat handwriting and a check enough to hush debts, as if flipping a page, and the other with an unspoken promise. Make sure she is cared for. She did not notice the odd choreography behind us. She thanked him with the polite immunity of an old woman who had dealt with too much and expected nothing. Dominic bowed slightly, a man who had returned to human rituals for a second. I wanted to think that kindness had cracked him open. I wanted to think he might be redeemed by small gestures. But when we left, his silence was a reminder that the kindness had a currency I could not pay for. Forced proximity has its own grammar. Small rules written in tiny daily acts that become punctuation marks of a life that is neither fully chosen nor fully imposed. He brought me into his kitchen one mid-morning and handed me a mug of coffee like it was an offering. He asked me about the clinic where I worked, about how I handled the steady, unglamorous kindness that nursing often requires. I told him stories of patients who had no one, of the way a nurse's presence could be a small form of miracle. He listened with a frankness that made my cheeks hot. He asked once, startlingly, if I had ever been tempted to leave everything behind and run. My answer was honest. Sometimes, yes, especially on the nights when the hunger in my chest was louder than my practicality. He smiled, then in a way that suggested he had known this all along. "Run with me," he said lightly, an impossible, dangerous suggestion, then immediately withdrew it like a test he hadn't meant to administer. His idea of freedom was not mine. My freedom was my mother's hands in mine and cheap coffee at 3 a.m. His freedom involved an empire and rules. Our conversations were a series of negotiations, some explicit, how much I would be allowed to go out, who would be permitted to contact me, and some not, the slow, mutual recognition of each other's edges. I learned his softer expletives, and he learned my stubbornness, how I folded it into lists and obligations. He was meticulous in solving every exterior problem that threatened me. A loan that had been called in, a man who remembered my face from the alley and had the wrong reasons to seek me out, even the small fact of my phone records. Each problem he cleared felt like a brushstroke of care and a signature of ownership. I hated him for saving me and loved him for the same reason. There were nights when we would sit in the vast living room and he would tell me bits of his history as one would read entries from a ledger rather than confess them. Childhood in a neighborhood that bred wolves and saints, a brother whose loyalty made him both saint and martyr, a father whose silence taught him to speak in threats. He was open about his code, a line you didn't cross, people you did not betray, and guarded about the reasons he had built walls so high. He told me, bluntly, that the world was only tamed by those willing to dominate it. And then, oddly, he asked me what I believed. I laughed at first, because people like him rarely bothered with belief beyond profit and territory. But I answered anyway. I believed in quiet, honest things, caring for the vulnerable, offering comfort without expectation. He studied my hands as if they had been a map all along, the knuckles, the small scars from needle sticks, the leftover ink from forms. "You are an honest woman," he said. "That is valuable." It was a dangerous flattery. I could feel my heart flutter the way a trapped bird might. The notion of something like attraction was odd under his roof, a luxury we could neither afford nor pretend to indulge. But the human heart wants what it wants, and the night was long and full of strange mercy. The outside threat that had sent me under his protection did not dissolve quietly. The people who had orchestrated the warehouse meeting were relentless types, greedy, sloppy, puffed up by the belief that any man, no matter how powerful, harbored blind spots. They made moves, hired guns who slipped messages into the plants around the mansion, a drone that hovered too close to the perimeter, a man in a coffee shop who stared at me until he left with blood in his fingers. Dominic's response was a cascade of force. He didn't simply dispatch threats. He dismantled them, sending shockwaves through networks that had thought themselves secure. There was a car that blew up on a side street and a phone line that went silent along with a man who had been a problem in more ways than one. When the violence happened, it carried with it a certain, terrible clarity. Dominic would not wait for threats to grow. He would cut them out like rot. He didn't wade in like a berserker. He removed pieces of danger with surgical precision. After an attack, when the house's staff locked down the estate and the mood turned into an almost religious hush, he came to me with a look that was not troubling but resolute. "These are the people who would hurt you," he said. "You are not to step into their path." I pushed back, the first time in a long series of guarded protests. "I'm not a child," I said. "I have a life. I have to be there for my mother." He looked like he had been struck. Anger flashed across his features, and then a calculation. "Then you will go with an escort," he replied. There was no room for debate. He had built his world on certainty and the notion that defiance without infrastructure was foolhardy. Forced proximity did its slow work on his heart as well. He began to trust me with small things, and the trust grew like the softest kind of contagion. He let me see him when he was not performing. The nights where the mask fell away and he simply sat, fingers tangled, staring at a photograph of a boy who used to steal bread. "He would have been brilliant," he said once. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, and I realized then that he was not a monster in the cartoonish sense the movies made him. He was a man who had built an empire to control grief, to make sure pain could not surprise him again. He was also capable of protectiveness that erred into possessiveness. The line between care and control wavered like heat off asphalt. I felt that line many times when he insisted on deciding who called me, when he corrected the way I dressed for the hospital, when he stood a little too close and told me in a low voice that I was his. Those words hit like a charge and left me dizzy. There was a primitive certainty in his assertion that both terrified and soothed me. He didn't offer romance in the ways of novels. He offered backup plans and a plan for my mother, and then, slowly and insistently, gestures of household intimacy, asking if I liked the soup, keeping the thermostat at a temperature I preferred. Little by little, romance crept in like ivy, clinging to the scaffolding of fear and gratitude. When the external threat escalated into a personal attack, the narrative snapped into violent motion. It started with a man who tried to follow me to the hospital, shadowed my steps across the parking lot, and then lunged as I turned for my mother's door. I remember the smell of dust and antiseptic and the sudden, domestic violence of a hand grabbing my wrist. I remember the sting of surprise, how shock and adrenaline blessed my limbs with the wrong kind of strength. The man sought profit in seeing me threatened. He sought leverage. He wanted me to be a bargaining chip. His plan unraveled the instant Dominic's men moved. They were everywhere at once, not as swarms, but as inevitability. The man was taken, subdued with a precision that felt like art and cruelty combined. Dominic arrived in the ER with a calm that could rearrange the laws of physics. He stood in the doorway like an edict. I watched him from a bed where my mother slept, and in that moment, something opened. The man who had orchestrated every violent move had also saved me in a way that was absolute. There was no room left for fantasy, only hard, consequential reality. He had provided the solution to my immediate problem. The attacker would not stand trial because he would no longer exist to stand. Dominic's methods were final, his justice not bound by statutes, but by expedience. It struck me cold that the lines he cut to protect me were often final ones. There was no softening around the edges when he moved. After the attack, the house was quieter, but the quiet had teeth. I moved through the rooms like someone in a borrowed life, adjusting and resisting in equal measure. Dominic's gestures toward me became more obvious. An unguarded look across the breakfast table, a hand on the small of my back when we walked the grounds, the way he drew his chair to face mine at night. He said nothing of love, because in his vocabulary, such admissions were premium goods, rarely spent and never squandered. Instead, he proved his feelings in the only way he knew how, by dismantling threats, by paying what had to be paid, by ensuring that no shadow could reach me. The most definitive moment came when he offered me a ring. It was not the kind of ring you find in fairy tales. No glittering heart, no ostentatious flourish. It was a simple band, heavy and warm, the inside engraved with initials that did not match mine. When he put it in my palm, he spoke in a low, declarative cadence I had come to know. "Take it," he said. "It marks you. It keeps you." The symbolism was clear. To wear it was to accept his claim, and to accept his claim was to accept a life in which my autonomy would be negotiated and counted. My first instinct was to recoil. I did not want to be property. I wanted to feel free to leave if I chose. Yet the ring was also a promise that he would keep us both safe, that he would stitch a life that could hold my mother and my own quiet ambitions. I looked at the metal and saw my reflection, slightly distorted, and then met his gaze. His expression was not demand so much as invitation. I slid it onto my finger. The decision wasn't a linear one. It was messy, a series of compromises that grated and soothed. I negotiated boundaries. My mother could visit. I could work limited shifts at the clinic. I would be consulted on decisions where my life was at direct stake. Dominic listened with a sureness that suggested he had never been refused. He accepted those boundaries not as an affront, but as calibration, as if setting parameters made our contract stronger. He showed me, gradually, the heart beneath the steel. He spoke of stability, of a life where we held power and used it to shelter those we loved. He taught me how to throw a punch in a way that felt ridiculous, and also like reclaiming an inch of myself. Under his watch, I found a voice that did not tremble as often. He was not without darkness. There were nights when the mansion felt like an echo chamber of decisions that had cost other people their peace, but he was also fierce in ways that made me consider building something with him. The crescendo of our entanglement came when the enemy, who had orchestrated the initial shootout, was finally cornered. Dominic moved with a finality that erased the threat. There were moments of violence, precise and cold, and then the quiet aftermath where the men returned to the mansion smelling faintly of smoke and the city's rain. When the final danger passed, there was a strange unthreading of tension that left the house in an almost sacred hush. The men who had stood watch relaxed. Rosa let out a laugh in the kitchen that sounded like a release. Marco sat by the fireplace with a paper and a pen and doodled in a way that made him look human. Dominic called me into his study and closed the door. The air felt charged with something soft and monumental. He stood in the middle of the rug and looked at me with an insistence that made my chest ache. He told me, in that short, declarative cadence that had marked our negotiation, what he wanted. He wanted me, not as a trophy, but as a partner, he said. He wanted me to stay. He wanted my life to be intertwined with his in ways that would require sacrifice and strength. He said, I will give you everything I have. I will give you safety and a place at my side. Be with me. It was astonishing, absurd, terrifying. I had not expected the man who could command men to speak in such unvarnished terms. I had not expected to feel the answer rise in my chest like a tide. I thought of my mother and her small, steady hands. I thought of the clinic and the patients whose lives were fragile. I thought of my own battered self, the way I had been taught to carry burdens and never ask for someone to lighten them. Then I said yes. Saying yes was not a capitulation so much as a recognition of a life rearranged. It was an admission that I trusted him, not blindly, but with eyes open to the costs. We married in a quiet ceremony in the mansion's backyard beneath a pale sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. The men who had protected me stood by in suits that suggested reverence more than attendance. Rosa adjusted my hair with a tenderness that felt like a benediction. Marco stood as best man and did not smile, because men like him do not parade emotions. Dominic came to the aisle in a way that suggested he had rehearsed his restraint. When we exchanged vows, it felt like two contracts merging, the legalities and the unspoken promises of protection and partnership. He pressed a band onto my finger and then his own on my hand. He said simply, "You're safer with me." Those words, once a threat, had become a balm and a chain. I kissed him in a way that tasted of salt and forgiveness. After the ceremony, in the hush of a room that had once been a battlefield of decisions, he took my hand and said, "This is not the end. It is the beginning. We will build." I felt for the first time like someone had given me the tools to shape my life rather than a script I was forced to follow. He had offered me safety and power and a place at his side, and I had accepted on the terms we'd negotiated together. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were architecture. I learned his language, how to speak to bodies that obeyed him, how to navigate the legal and the illegal, how to keep a ledger that measured kindness and debt. I also taught him small things, how to make my mother's prescribed soup, how to attend a charity gala without sending the wrong message, how to speak to people with power softly enough they wouldn't be startled into rebellion. Our partnership was an exchange of wills and mutual extension. We argued like two stubborn horses and we reconciled like conspirators. He occasionally lost patience in ways that unsettled me, but he always returned with a contrition that matched his seriousness. He protected not by smothering, but by building structures, a foundation that sponsored clinics like the one where I'd worked, scholarships in my mother's name, a hospital wing named in quiet tribute to the lives he'd lost. It was, in a certain way, redemption. He was also pragmatic. Enemies remained enemies, and when they returned, they found not a broken woman, but a united front. The final confrontation came as a test of both his control and my agency. Those who had tried to unseat him found themselves wrong-footed. Their attempts escalated into a public chaos that couldn't be ignored, and Dominic chose a decisive, public act to end it. A confrontation staged in front of men who thought themselves untouchable. He did not seek to appease the law. He sought to disarm bravado. He executed his plan with a brutal elegance that left the city reading headlines and watching in breathless disbelief. It was over with an efficiency that had a moral grayness. When the dust settled and the men who had tried to seize power were either gone or broken, Dominic came to me and said, "We are together now, in every sense." He framed our mutual decisions as a partnership, not a surrender. He proposed, in a way, the marriage of two problem solvers. I saw in his eyes the flicker of tenderness and the familiar shadow of his old grief. He had not been purified. He had simply learned to direct his force towards something that did not involve us as disposable pawns. We made plans then, no, not plans, foundations. We set up the clinic with funds that would ensure no one like my mother would suffer without medicine. We started programs for children in neighborhoods like the one Dominic had come from. He taught me how to be loud in places that had never asked to be heard. We began building a life that was neither a prison nor a fantasy, but a constructed reality in which we both had roles that suited our histories and our strengths. He taught me power, the power to command resources to fix systemic problems, and I taught him patience and the quiet rewards of unseen care. We were an unlikely pair, stitched together by circumstance and then by choice. Somewhere along the road, my fear had changed its nature. I felt less like the woman who had dwindled under bills and hospital lights, and more like someone who had reclaimed agency, not by fleeing danger, but by enveloping it, redirecting it. Love in our world was not a gentle thing. It was a mosaic of small acts. The way he would ensure a doctor I trusted was on staff, the way I arranged flowers in his study to keep the house from smelling like the corridors of power, the nights we'd spend planning strategies and listening to symphonies while the city slept. There were still shadows. There were still nights I woke clutching the inside of my wrist where my ring sat a little too tight. There were days when men from his past came to remind us of the price of standing tall. But each time we met it together. He stood by me, not as a tyrant, but as a partner who understood obligation. I began to understand his violence as a language, harsh, final, but often aimed at protecting a geometry of people he considered family. He, in turn, learned that protection could be handed down without erasing the freedom of those you shield. In the end, the largest battle was not against enemies, but against our own fears. I had to forgive myself for the things I'd considered failures. Leaving a job, depending on money from a man with a dangerous reputation. Dominic had to let go of the belief that the only way to keep people safe was to dominate every part of their lives. We compromised. We built a life that allowed me to visit my mother's bedside without escort after the hospital arranged a care team funded by Dominic's foundation. I started a community outreach program and hosted it in a modest wing of the mansion. Outsiders called it charity. I called it reparation. He called it necessary. Sometimes we argued about the forms of power we practiced. He would say, "You think soft because you grew up with less, And I'd reply, "You think hard because you have always had to protect." We were right and wrong both. And in that overlap of truths, our relationship found traction. The final lines of the story are not a neat end, because lives collected under such circumstances rarely end neatly. But they do evolve. We stood on the balcony on an autumn evening, the kind that smells of dry leaves and would smoke, and we watched the city we had both tried to alter. Dominic wrapped his arm around me, not possessively, but as an anchor. He whispered into my hair the words that had started in an alley, but had found a new meaning over time. "You're safer with me." This time the sentence was a vow. I leaned into him, feeling the steadiness of his chest, the crowded history in his bones. I had been a woman who witnessed a deal she shouldn't have, who was rescued by a man whose hands could both soothe and destroy. I had been brought into a gilded cage and then taught how to open its doors from the inside. He had offered me protection and, in time, partnership. That is how we build a life together, through negotiations, through pain, through public violence and private tenderness. We were not perfect. We were complicated and raw and real in ways that scared even us. But we were together, and in a world that favored the powerful, we chose to use that power to shelter the vulnerable and to create a fragile kind of justice. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, please like and subscribe for more stories and leave feedback or suggestions in the comments.